It all begins in the smoldering ruins of Stalingrad. Winter still bites at the skin when the news spreads through the German lines like a disease. The Sixth Army was destroyed, not defeated, not retreated, annihilated. Hundreds of thousands of men surrounded, starving, frozen, surrendered or dead. There, on the banks of the Volga, something invisible dies too, the myth of German invincibility. Until then, many soldiers believed there would always be a plan, an organized retreat, a strategic miracle. After Stalingrad, that faith shattered like thin ice under heavy boots. The Red Army, now strengthened, advanced relentlessly. There were no more pauses, no more safe borders. The Soviets come like a tide, pushing tanks, infantry and artillery across the white steppes, crushing everything in their path. The Wehrmacht begins to retreat, but it's not a clean retreat. Its collapse roads are clogged with burnt-out trucks, makeshift carts, and dead horses frozen in the middle of the road. Soldiers walk for days with their feet wrapped in rags, leaving trails of blood in the snow. Units become mixed up, orders are lost, and officers shout commands that no one can follow anymore. The cold is unforgiving. Every night, men fall asleep and don't wake up. Others wake up and find their fingers stiff and black. Gangrene starts right there, silent. The wind cuts her face like blades. Hunger gnaws at her stomach. Fear now is constant. It's no longer the fear of losing a battle. It's the fear of not escaping the East. Meanwhile, behind them, the sound of war grows louder. The thunder of Soviet artillery echoes on the horizon. Villages are swallowed up, bridges explode. The Red Army not only advances, he hunts. Every kilometer lost is a step deeper into the frozen hell. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat. It was the moment the war changed direction. From then on, the German retreat through the east would not be an orderly march of soldiers. It would be a desperate escape, marked by blood, snow, and men left behind, too injured to run. As the retreat progresses, a cruel truth quickly becomes apparent. Not everyone can keep up. War waits for no one weak, and the East shows no mercy to the wounded. In every abandoned village, in every destroyed barn, lie fallen men, some groaning softly, others already silent, gazing at the grey sky, unsure if they are still alive or merely waiting to die. There are soldiers with legs shattered by artillery fire, others with bullets lodged in their abdomens, clutching their entrails with their bare hands. Many have undergone hasty surgery without sufficient anesthesia, stitched up with fingers trembling from the cold. They try to stand when they hear the order to retreat, but their bodies don't respond. Their legs give way. The pain is immediate, blinding. Comrades try to help at first. 2 men support a third, dragging him through the snow. But after a few kilometers, shoulders give way, breathing fails, and someone needs to make a decision. Carrying a wounded soldier means delaying the unit. Delaying the unit means dying along with them. The sound of boots fades into the distance. An injured person cries for help. Another no longer cries out. He has learned that no one returns. Some beg. Others simply close their eyes, as if sleep could delay the inevitable. Some try to crawl alone, leaving a red trail in the white snow, until the cold overcomes their will. Trucks pass by, too full to stop. Trains no longer arrive. Horses are dead or as weak as the men. The battlefield shifts location, but the wounded remain behind, trapped between the past and the approaching death from the east. And the worst part isn't the physical pain. It's the moment they realize the stark truth. The war went on without them. There, on the frozen ground, a second battle begins, not against the enemy, but against the cold, the weather, and abandonment. And almost no one wins this fight. Field hospitals on the run. When the shooting stops, for a few moments, field hospitals appear, if they can even be called that. Destroyed schools, roofless churches, barns full of dirty straw. There are no clean walls, no silence, no rest, only constant moans, the metallic smell of blood and the cold seeping in through every crack. Doctors and nurses work tirelessly. Their hands are cracked. The instruments stick to their skin from the cold. There's no time for lengthy diagnoses. A quick glance decides a man's fate. This one walks. This one doesn't. Those who don't walk stay behind. Those who walk immediately head for the road to retreat. The surgeries take place on the floor. One soldier holds another while the saw cuts through a frozen limb. There isn't enough anesthesia. Sometimes there isn't any at all. Shouts echo through the building, mixed with the distant roar of approaching Soviet artillery. Each explosion reminds everyone that time is up. Stretchers pile up, men stacked side by side, some already dead, others waiting for treatment that may never come. The morphine runs out first, then the antibiotics. Finally, even the clean water disappears. Snow is melted in rusty cans to clean open wounds. Then the order arrives. Short, cold, immediate withdrawal. Available ambulances are few and far between. They barely accommodate the doctors, some equipment, and the wounded who can still sit up. There's never enough room for everyone. The chief doctor walks around the makeshift ward. He knows what he needs to do. Some soldiers receive a last piece of bread, others a blanket too thin for the cold to come. Some receive only a look, heavy, laden with guilt. When the engines start, the sound is deafening. For those who remain, that noise means only one thing: the end. The field hospital, which was supposed to save lives, is transformed into a place of silent waiting for death or capture. The doors close, the trucks leave, and on the cold ground, between broken walls, lie the men whom the war decided to abandon. The silent order: abandon. There is no speech, there are no shouts, there is no written order posted on the wall. The abandonment happens in silence, and that's what makes it even more cruel. Officers avoid looking the wounded in the eye. Doctors close their backpacks too slowly, as if that could delay the inevitable. Everyone understands what is happening, but no one says it aloud. The criteria are brutal and simple. Those who walk, go. Those who don't move, stay behind. Some soldiers try to bargain with fate. A man with a crushed leg crawls to an officer, clutching his boot with both bloodied hands. He pleads. He says he can sit up, that he doesn't take up space, that he can endure the pain. The officer slowly lets go, without violence, but also without hope. He had already made that choice many times that week. There are wounded people who ask for a weapon, not to fight, to end it all right there. Others ask only for a cigarette, a final human gesture before total abandonment. Some doctors, broken inside, administer extra doses of morphine in the most severe cases. It's not treatment, it's mercy in disguise. Blankets are distributed as if they could save someone. A piece of stale bread, a nearly empty canteen. Small things, useless compared to what lies ahead. The cold is already there, seeping into the bones. Night falls quickly in the east, and with it comes the heavy silence that precedes death. When the last men leave, the building becomes strange, too quiet, only low. Moans, ragged breaths, wet coughs. The wounded look at each other, understanding that now only they remain. There is no longer an army. There is no longer a homeland. There is no longer organized war. Outside, the footsteps fade into the distance. Then, nothing. At that moment, many realize a truth that is impossible to forget. Being injured wasn't what condemned them. It was because I survived too long. The order was never officially announced, but it was followed to the letter. And for those left behind, the war ended there, not with honor but with utter abandonment. Winter as a death sentence. When night falls, the real enemy appears. He doesn't wear a uniform, he doesn't make the sound of boots, he doesn't fire shots. It's winter. He enters slowly, occupying every corner of the abandoned building, every crack in the walls, every lung that breathes with difficulty. The temperature plummets without warning, and the cold begins to work with murderous patience. The wounded try to protect themselves as best they can. One man pulls the blanket up to his chin, even knowing it's too thin. Another crawls a few inches closer to a companion, seeking human warmth. Some try to stay awake, repeating to themselves that sleeping is dangerous, because many already know this. If you fall asleep, you might not wake up again. The pain changes form. First, it burns, then it disappears. The fingers become stiff, numb. The skin begins to darken, turning blue, then black. Some realize too late that they have lost their feet to frostbite. Others only discover it when they try to move and feel nothing. Snow begins to seep in through the broken roof, slowly piling up over the bodies. A soldier wakes up covered in white, as if he had already been buried. He tries to scream, but his parched throat only lets out a weak, almost childlike sound. No one answers. The groans diminish as the hours pass. Outside, the wind howls like a continuous lament. Inside, the silence grows. One by one, the wounded stop moving. Some die conscious, staring into the darkness. Others simply fade away, their bodies giving up while their minds still try to understand what happened. There are no gunshots. There are no explosions. Death arrives cold, slow, and inevitable. When dawn finally arrives, it brings no relief. It merely reveals the scene. Stiff bodies, open eyes frozen in time, hands clutching at nothing. Winter has done what the enemy didn't need to do. For those men, the war ended there. Not on the battlefield, but in the silent snow of the east. The doctor's desperation. Some doctors can't leave. When the trucks depart and silence falls, they're still there. Stained lab coats, hands smeared with dried blood, eyes sunken with exhaustion. They know exactly what that means. Staying is signing your own death warrant, but leaving would mean abandoning men who are still breathing. These doctors walk among the wounded like shadows. They check weak pulses, touch cold foreheads, whisper words that barely sound human. They no longer promise a cure, they promise only presence. For many soldiers, that's all that remains, not to die completely alone. Without supplies, medicine becomes a brutal improvisation. One doctor cuts a coat to make bandages. Another uses vodka to clean open wounds. Infections spread rapidly, swollen flesh, a sweet, putrid odor heralding gangrene. There's no way to amputate. There's no way to save. Only delay the end for a few hours. There are impossible decisions. A soldier is delirious, begs for help, calls for his mother. The doctor knows he won't survive the night. The remaining morphine fits in a syringe. Using it to ease one man's pain means denying comfort to 10 others. Every choice weighs like lead on the conscience. When the distant sound of Soviet tanks begins to echo, time runs out. Some medics write notes and place them in the wounded's pockets with names and units, hoping that someone someday will know who they were. Others simply sit on the ground, too exhausted to flee. Many doctors deliberately choose to stay, not out of ideology, not because of orders, but because, in that frozen hell, abandoning their patients would be crossing a line from which they could not return. When the enemy arrives, they know they will not be treated as saviors. They will be prisoners or killed. Even so, they remain, because in that final moment, amidst groans and silence, their humanity is the last living thing in that place. The relentless advance of the Red Army. Imagine, if you can, the icy twilight of a European winter in the heart of World War II, where the air condenses into white mist with each agonizing breath. It is not just the bone-chilling cold, it is the inescapable certainty that the known world is crumbling under the weight of an inexorable force. The Red Army, that colossal machine of vengeance forged in the furnaces of the Great Patriotic War, advances like a tsunami of steel and fury, devouring miles of scorched earth that once belonged to the Third Reich. We are talking about 1944-1945, the peak of the Soviet counter-offensive, when operations like Bagration and Vistula Oder crushed the German lines, leaving behind a trail of ghost towns and lost souls. Millions of Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of Nazi invasions that incinerated entire villages in Ukraine and Belarus, now march with the accumulated hatred of those who saw mothers and children burned alive in barns or entire families shot in mass graves. This advance is not mere military strategy, it is biblical retribution, where each step echoes the atrocities of Babi Yar, Katyn, and countless other massacres. The first sign, like an apocalyptic omen, doesn't emerge from the eyes, but from the ears and the earth itself. A deep primordial rumble, like the roar of an angry god awakening from the depths, makes the ground tremble in waves that spread through the ruins. At first, it's distant, a murmur that could be mistaken for the howling wind or the thunder of a distant storm. But it soon intensifies, becoming a deafening crescendo that vibrates in the chests of the abandoned wounded. These are the T-34 tanks, those Soviet armored monsters, mass-produced in the Ural and Leningrad factories, where starving workers labored under constant bombardment to forge these 26-ton beasts. Each track screeching over the compacted snow crushes not only the ice, but the illusion of safety that remained. Accompanying them, the dry roar of the Katyusha. Artillery, the famous Stalin's organs, launching salvos of rockets that illuminate the night sky with infernal sparks, as if the firmament were splitting in two. Each explosion, a miniature cataclysm, sends dust and fragments of plaster falling from the ceilings already cracked and weakened by months of Allied and German bombing. This dust, as fine as talcum powder, covers the wounded like volcanic ash, transforming them into living statues of a modern Pompeii, where the volcano is war and the lava is frozen blood. The abandoned men, those German soldiers left behind in makeshift field hospitals, in the basements of bombed-out buildings, perhaps in devastated Warsaw or on the outskirts of agonizing Berlin, hear everything with terrifying clarity. They don't need to raise their blindfolded eyes or turn their bandaged heads to understand the inevitable. They are veterans of the Eastern Front, many of them survivors of Stalingrad in 1942-1943, where 91,000 Germans were captured after the Soviet siege that killed hundreds of thousands in the Siberian cold. Now here, dread settles in like a toxic fog. Some, with limbs hastily amputated without anesthesia, try to crawl to a darker corner of the damp hall, their broken fingernails scraping against the cracked concrete floor like rats fleeing a flood. They delude themselves with the idea that the shadows will protect them, but their hearts race, cold sweat runs down despite the ice, and their stomachs churn in knots of pure terror. Others remain motionless, paralyzed like prey before a predator, staring at the half-open door with glazed eyes, silently praying for a swift end, a merciful bullet instead of the slow agony of the bayonet or interrogation. Fear is no longer abstract, a vague threat from radio bulletins. It has sound, the metallic clang of caterpillars, weight, the tremor that makes wounds bleed again, and direction coming inexorably from the east, where the rising sun symbolizes not hope, but the dawn of an era of retaliation. Outside, chaos unfolds in a deadly ballet of destruction. Shots from PPSH-41 rifles, the Soviet submachine guns known for their rapid and merciless fire, crackle like whips in the frigid air, echoing between the riddled facades of once grand buildings. Orders are shouted in guttural Russian, "Vpered za rodinu," urging the Red soldiers forward, many of them peasants recruited from the steppes, hardened by the famine of the Holodomor in the 1930s and Nazi brutality. Besides, fighting passes too quickly, a whirlwind of violence sweeping through streets covered in rubble and frozen bodies. There is no organized defense. The German front, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, has disintegrated under the weight of Soviet numerical superiority. 6 million Red troops against the exhausted remnants of the Nazis. There is no real resistance, only sporadic shots from abandoned Kar-98K rifles, echoing like last gasps. What remains are empty buildings, with windows shattered like Gouged out eyes, motionless wounded on makeshift beds of dirty straw, and exhausted doctors, many of them field surgeons who operated under flickering flashlights, awaiting the inevitable like prisoners of a destiny written in blood. When the first Soviet soldiers burst through the door, kicking it open with heavy boots studded with frozen mud, the scene is revealed in all its visceral brutality. The hall, lit by a single hanging lamp that swings like a pendulum of death, is filled with men, lying on the floor, some legless, their extremities bandaged in bloody rags that smell of gangrene, others unconscious, their faces pale as wax, breathing in shallow gasps that echo like winds in an empty cave. Frozen, dark, sticky blood mixes with the snow that seeps through the cracks, forming red puddles that gleam ominously. The smell is strong, a nauseating mixture of pus, urine, feces, and incipient decomposition, difficult to ignore even for the hardened. For some Soviets, veterans of Kursk or Leningrad, this is just another war scene, a living tableau of routine horrors. For others, it fuels the hatred accumulated over years of destruction, villages burned in Operation Barbarossa of 1941, where Nazis incinerated thousands, families killed in mass executions like the 33,000 Jews at Babi Yar, or besieged cities like Sevastopol, where civilians perished from starvation. This hatred boils in their eyes, transforming soldiers into judges and executioners. Some, wounded, with remaining strength, raise their hands with difficulty, trembling like leaves in the wind, even without weapons to surrender. Others try to speak, stammering in fragmented German or Russian learned in previous prisons, explaining that they cannot fight, pointing to stumps of limbs or open wounds that expose white bones. Some weep silently, hot tears tracing furrows in the dirt of their faces, a mute lament of utter despair. The sound of boots echoes through the hall, heavy, definitive, each step like the hammering of a verdict. A Soviet soldier, perhaps a 19-year-old, from a destroyed Ukrainian farm, points his weapon, the cold barrel of the Tokarev TT-33 gleaming in the dim light. Another looks around, assessing with cold eyes, calculating whether these enemies deserve pity or the weight of popular justice. In that suspended moment, everything depends on who enters through the door. Discipline, imposed by the political commissars marching behind, preaching the glory of the Soviet Union and the need for prisoners for interrogations about remaining Nazi positions, or vengeance, the primal impulse to repay the suffering of 27 million dead Soviets, including the 8 million civilians exterminated in concentration camps like Auschwitz, which the Reds would liberate in January 1945. Pity, a glimpse of humanity amidst the chaos, remembering that these wounded are also sons and husbands. Or fury, fueled by stories of mass rape and Nazi plunder in the occupied lands. For the abandoned, wounded, there is no longer any control over anything. The war has finally caught up with them in its rawest form, and now, motionless on the icy ground that sucks the heat from their bodies like an insatiable vampire, they discover that surviving this far did not mean being saved. Each second stretches into eternity, their hearts pounding like an execution drum, cold sweat mingling with dried blood, and terror settling in like a palpable presence, whispering that the end may be worse than death, a life of slavery in Siberian gulags, or a merciless bullet in the dark. Despair envelops them like a shroud, hopelessness suffocates them, and terror, terror is the maestro of this symphony of horrors, conducting every tremor, every faltering breath, every unshed tear. Capture, prisoners too weak to resist. When the dust settles, fine and suffocating like the mist of a cemetery at dawn, and the gunfire ceases, leaving only a ghostly echo in the empty streets, another phase of suffering begins. a transition from acute agony to chronic and insidious pain. We are in the immediate aftermath of the capture, in scenarios like Königsberg in 1945, where the Red Army surrounded and annihilated German forces, or on the plains of East Prussia, where civilian refugees and wounded soldiers were caught in the inexorable web of Soviet revenge. Some Red soldiers, exhausted but disciplined, put away their weapons, the legendary Mosin Nagant rifles with bayonets as sharp as guillotine blades, and observed the wounded with professional coldness, eyes that have seen too much to be easily moved. Others shout short orders, "Vystavai, podnimaites," demanding that they rise, words that cut through the air like whips, indifferent to language or physical condition. For many on the ground, these commands in Russian sound like alien gibberish, echoes of a hostile world that swallows them whole. Legs no longer exist. Amputated in emergency surgeries under crossfire, the body does not obey, paralyzed by exhaustion, infection, or sheer paralyzing terror. Those who can still move an arm, perhaps the only intact limb after grenades or mines, raise their hand slowly, a weak gesture of surrender that trembles in the frigid air like a white flag torn by the wind. There are no helmets falling to the ground with a metallic clang, no weapons handed over in symbolic piles of defeat. The surrender happens in absolute silence, made of downcast gazes and faltering breaths, irregular gasps that betray punctured lungs or hearts on the verge of collapse. A doctor, perhaps a German surgeon who served in the Afrika Korps before being transferred to the Eastern Hell, tries to explain in rudimentary Russian learned from previous prisoners, points to open wounds oozing yellowish pus, to unconscious men whose bodies writhe in feverish delirium. Sometimes a reluctant nod is heard, granting a momentary pause, sometimes not, and the silence is broken by a rough shove or a scream that echoes like a death verdict. The wounded deemed useful, those still breathing strongly despite broken ribs or bandaged bellies who can sit or prop themselves up on trembling elbows, are separated with brutal efficiency. They receive a shove in the back, a guttural command, a hard gaze that penetrates like a dagger. They become prisoners of war right there, without formal registration, without names noted on lists that could signify traceability or humanity. For them, the war hasn't ended. It has only changed hands, passing from Hitler's to Stalin's, where their fate could be a forced labor camp in Siberian coal mines, like the thousands sent after the Battle of Berlin, or endless interrogations in the damp cells of Lubyanka. The terror here is that of uncertainty. Will they be used as bargaining chips or discarded like human debris? Those unable to move remain where they are, abandoned once more, their bodies like anchors in a sea of chaos. Some Soviets drive straight past, focused on the relentless advance, eyes fixed on the horizon, where Berlin awaits like wounded prey. Others stop, assess with clinical glances, make quick decisions, life or death decided in seconds without appeal. There is no time for lengthy explanations. The front must continue, driven by the urgency of ending the war before the winter of 1945 freezes everything into stagnation. Gaz AA trucks, the Soviet victory trucks, roar in the background, waiting to transport prisoners or supplies, indifferent to the human drama. There are wounded men trying to crawl behind the soldiers, nails digging into the dirty snow, leaving red marks like trails of blood, pleading in hoarse voices not to be left behind again, echoing the initial abandonment by their own commanders who fled west. Some are pulled by their arms, bones creaking in protest, dragged like sacks of potatoes. Others are pushed back to the ground with a casual kick, each gesture dry, functional, devoid of emotion, as if they were mere obstacles in the path of history. When the prisoners are finally gathered outside, under the grey sky that pours snowflakes like sarcastic confetti, the shock is immediate and visceral. The wind cuts like a sharp knife, penetrating tattered uniforms that barely cover emaciated bodies, transforming tremors into uncontrollable convulsions. Nearly naked men, with worn-out boots and coats patched with rags, tremble incessantly, teeth chattering in irregular rhythms that sound like the castanets of death. Some fall to their knees in the deep snow, knees sinking as if into quicksand, unable to rise again, exhausted muscles betraying the will to survive. Those who fall slow the marching column, becoming a burden. Those who slow it down become a problem, perhaps solved with a bullet or abandoned to the cold that killed thousands on the Death March of 1945, where German prisoners perished on frozen roads. In that frigid instant, many understand a bitter truth, etched into their souls like a fiery tattoo. Being captured wounded is not salvation, an oasis in the desert of war. It is merely another chapter of pain, written with slow steps in snow that swallows footprints, and without any promise of survival. Fear transforms into profound despair, an abyss where hopes sink like stones. Terror reigns supreme, painting visions of endless gulags, of hunger that gnaws at the insides, of forced labor under whips and merciless guards. Each breath is a struggle, each glance exchanged with comrades is a silent farewell, and despair envelops them like an invisible current, dragging them into the depths of a hell that war, in its infinite cruelty, still holds in store. The eloquence of survival is lost in mute groans, and what remains is the eternal echo of human suffering, amplified by the vastness of history that crushes them without pity. Executions and revenge. In the dark heart of the Eastern Front, during the agonizing throes of World War II, between the autumn of 1944 and the bloody spring of 1945, as the Red Army swept across the plains of East Prussia and the devastated streets of cities like Königsberg and Danzig, not all those captured found the dubious relief of prison. War, that insatiable beast that devoured entire nations, arrived laden with memory, a collective memory, forged in the flames of brutal invasions that began in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, when Nazi hordes invaded the Soviet Union, leaving a trail of villages burned to the ground, where smoke rose like tormented souls for weeks on end. Memory of civilians killed by the thousands in summary executions, bodies piled in mass graves that reeked of decomposition under the scorching Ukrainian summer sun, of families buried in the merciless snow of Russian winters, where the cold preserved faces frozen in expressions of eternal terror like death masks sculpted by ice. For certain Soviet soldiers, many of them survivors of titanic battles like Moscow in 1941, where General Winter claimed more lives than bullets, or Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where the ground trembled with the weight of thousands of armored vehicles colliding like enraged titans. Those wounded men on the ground, with torn grey uniforms and faded Reich insignia, were not individuals with names, stories, or families waiting in distant German villages. They were the collective face of the enemy, the living symbol of the extermination machine that devastated the East for endless years, killing 27 million Soviets, including the innocent people of Leningrad, besieged for 872 days by famine and bombings that reduced the city to a skeleton of ghostly buildings, where rats and corpses vied for space in the streets. In this vortex of chaos and retribution, decisions were as swift as the blink of a condemned eye. A fleeting glance, laden with years of pent-up suffering, assessed the wounded man lying on the dirty floor of a basement, transformed into a makeshift hospital, where flickering lamps cast elongated shadows like accusing fingers, a subtle nod between comrades in arms, an almost imperceptible gesture that sealed destinies. The barrel of the Mosin Nagant rifle, cold and implacable, pointed downwards, aligning itself with the sweaty brow or the heaving chest. Some wounded, delirious with fever and the excruciating pain of infected wounds that pulsed like exposed hearts, didn't even understand what was happening, their glazed eyes lost in feverish visions of distant homes or past battles. Others, more lucid on the threshold of agony, perceived too late the deadly glint in the red soldier's eyes, his finger tensing the trigger in a movement that echoed the inevitability of history. A dry shot echoed inside the building, an abrupt crack that reverberated through the cracked walls, mingling with the distant groan of artillery and the howling wind outside. Then another and another, a rhythmic sequence like a judicial sentence, executed without judges or appeals. The sound was short, unceremonious, almost bureaucratic, like an officer's stamp on a death certificate, echoing the ruthless efficiency that characterized both advancing armies and the war machines that propelled them. Some pleaded, in a final surge of survival instinct that transcended physical pain. A man, perhaps a young Wehrmacht recruit drafted in the final days of the Reich, when 16-year-old boys were armed with rusty rifles, raised his hands trembling like dry leaves in autumn, his fingers stiffened by the cold and incipient gangrene, trying to speak in fragmented Russian, learned from prisoners or pamphlets, babbling phrases like "Nicht schießen, ich kann nicht kämpfen," "Don't fight, I can't fight," showing that he couldn't fight, that he posed no threat, pointing to an amputated leg that ended in a stump bandaged in bloody rags, reeking of infection. The answer came before the words were finished. A silent flash followed by a dull thud, the body falling heavily to where the ground like a sack of grain dropped. The dark blood, thick and viscous from the cold, spreading through the seeped snow like ink spilled on white parchment, forming abstract patterns that looked like maps of lost territories. The terror at that instant was absolute, an abyss that swallowed the soul, the despair of seeing life vanish in the blink of an eye, the hopelessness of knowing that pleas fell on deaf ears, hardened by horrors like the massacres in Katyn, where an entire village was incinerated alive by the Nazis in retaliation against partisans, or in Babi Yar, where 33,000 Jews were shot in a ravine that became a mass grave. It wasn't always pure hatred, that primal fury bubbling in their veins like volcanic lava. Sometimes it was haste, the relentless urgency of the front that allowed no pauses, where every minute lost could mean the death of comrades in ambushes or desperate counterattacks by the SS remnants. Sometimes it was cruel logistics, a cold arithmetic of survival. There was no way to transport all those broken bodies in overloaded trucks that creaked under the weight of meager ammunition and supplies. There wasn't enough food, rationed into crumbs of stale bread and watery soup that barely sustained the Red soldiers themselves, many of whom survived on frozen potatoes dug from the hard earth. There were no doctors available, overwhelmed with the Soviet wounded arriving in endless waves from battles like Vistula Oder, where rivers were stained red. Seriously wounded meant delay, a dead weight dragging the column down like anchors on a sinking ship, and delay on the merciless front meant death for many others, exposing them to counter-offensives or to the cold-blooded killer that claimed lives with the same efficiency as a machine gun. Some Soviet soldiers, perhaps a veteran of Stalingrad, where the siege of 1942-1943 had transformed the city into a labyrinth of ruins and frozen bodies, turned their faces away and moved on, their eyes lowered, avoiding the spectacle, their hearts heavy with a vestige of humanity that the war was trying to extinguish. Others stood paralyzed for a second, time freezing like the air around them, breathing deeply the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood, and did what they believed was necessary, pulling the trigger with a resignation that masked their inner torment. There was no celebration, no cry of triumph or sadistic laughter. There was no pleasure, only a frigid emptiness that settled in. The soul, like the heavy silence after the last shot, a silence that echoed louder than the gunshots, laden with ghosts and regrets that would haunt dreams for decades. The terror for the executioners was subtle, a slow poison that corroded sanity, transforming heroes into reluctant executioners. For those who survived this brutal selection process, a Russian roulette of mercy and revenge, the image never faded, etched into their minds like an indelible scar. They limped on, supporting each other in a brotherhood forged in shared pain, knowing they had survived by a tiny detail. Perhaps a look that evoked pity, a gesture of surrender that touched a forgotten chord of compassion, or by chance, a soldier who decided not to pull the trigger in that fleeting instant, turning to another target. Fear haunted them like a long shadow, the despair of reliving each execution in nightmares, the terror of knowing that the line between life and death was as thin as a layer of ice over a treacherous river. In the retreat from the east, that chaotic rout of collapsing German forces, death didn't just come from the cold that froze limbs and souls, or the hunger that gnawed at entrails like a starving animal. Sometimes it came in the form of vengeance, swift as lightning, definitive as the closing of a coffin, and impossible to forget. A spectre that haunted the survivors through the years, whispering in the winds of memory that war spared no one, neither the victors nor the vanquished. Death marches for those who were still breathing, for the wounded, who by a quirk of fate or a glimpse of humanity amidst the chaos, escaped immediate execution. Perhaps in scenarios like the forced evacuation of Courland in 1945, where pockets of German troops were isolated and crushed, or on the muddy roads of Pomerania, where the Red Army pursued the remnants like relentless hunters, suffering took on another form. A cruel metamorphosis from acute pain to a prolonged agony that tested the limits of human endurance. They were hastily rounded up, pushed and dragged out of makeshift shelters where the air still smelled of fresh gunpowder and blood, and thrown onto the road like cattle, branded for slaughter. The order was simple, shouted in harsh Russian by exhausted guards whose uniforms were hardened by ice. WW2, walk, proceed. It didn't matter if the leg was broken into shrapnel by grenade fragments, the bones protruding like dry branches. If the foot was frozen, swollen and black from necrosis spreading like a plague. If the wound still bled, a constant trickle that stained the snow-dark red, attracting the smell of death. Those who could stay on their feet, even if staggering like a drunkard on a tightrope, carried on. Those who couldn't stayed behind, abandoned to the whims of winter, where the cold slowly claimed them, transforming them into frozen statues that the wind would cover with a white cloak of oblivion. The march began slowly, a collective dragging of feet that echoed like a muffled lament over the frozen earth, but it soon transformed into a living nightmare, a walking purgatory where each kilometer was an eternity of torment. The ground was a treacherous carpet of hard snow and slippery ice, furrowed by deep ruts left by tanks and trucks that passed like mechanical specters. Each step was a new, excruciating pain, as if hot needles pierced the soles of their feet, rising up their legs like poison. Some soldiers improvised crutches with broken branches from the skeletal forests around them, gnarled branches that creaked under the weight, or with discarded rifles whose barrels bent like straws. Others leaned on their comrades, forming crooked lines of limping men, stumbling over hidden roots or frozen stones, falling into human piles that unraveled with muffled groans. The wind cut across his face like invisible blades, entering his lungs like icy fire that burned his airways, turning each breath into an arduous struggle. His breath escaped in white clouds, ephemeral as dissipated hopes, condensing in the air that hovered below zero, where temperatures could drop to 30 degrees like the Siberian winters the Soviets knew so well. Many had no gloves, their hands exposed to the biting air that stiffened them into useless claws, their fingers swelling and darkening with frostbite, where the initial pain gave way to a treacherous numbness that preceded inevitable amputation. One man tried to adjust. His torn coat, patched with rags from the uniforms of dead comrades, and realized with growing dread that he could no longer feel his own hand. the nerves deadened by the cold, as if they had been cut by a surgical knife. Another fell to his knees, his body betraying his iron will, trying to rise with trembling arms, but his legs simply wouldn't respond, muscles frozen in cadaverous rigidity, despair suffocating him like an invisible hand, squeezing his throat. The guards, red soldiers, hardened. By similar marches in previous retreats, such as the withdrawal from Smolensk in 1941, shouted to keep going, their voices hoarse from the cold and fatigue. Not out of gratuitous cruelty, although the latent hatred for years of Nazi occupation, with its concentration camps like Majdanek, liberated in 1944, revealing piles of human bones, might have tinged their actions, but because the column needed to move, driven by the need to reach supply lines or transit camps before the front swallowed them up again. To stop meant becoming a target for local partisans, becoming a logistical problem in an army already struggling with shortages, becoming a body in the snow, a disposable obstacle. When someone fell for the second or third time, glances shifted, a conspiratorial silence settling in, no one wanting to be the next to attract merciless attention, the terror of being left behind as a useless burden. Bodies began to fall behind, marking the path like macabre breadcrumbs on an inverted Hansel and Gretel trail, where the end was death instead of salvation. There were no burials, no rituals to honor the fallen, no farewells, only a last furtive glance or a murmur of whispered prayer. Just dark stains on the white snow, blood frozen in irregular patterns, quickly covered by the wind that howled like a chorus of lost souls, erasing evidence as if the earth wanted to forget the horror. The march continued as if nothing had happened, the relentless pace dictated by the steps of the strongest, despair growing like a wave that threatened to submerge everyone. The wounded learned quickly, in a brutal school of survival, not to fall, even if the world spun in a dizzying spiral of exhaustion, not to complain, swallowing groans that might attract a shove or worse, not to draw attention, merging into the anonymous mass of collective suffering. Survival depended on appearing slightly less weak than the man next to you, a grim competition where weakness was punished with abandonment, echoing Nazi death marches like the one in Bataan in 1942, but now inverted in retaliation. These marches had no clear destination for those participating, a veil of uncertainty that amplified the terror. Perhaps a prisoner of war camp, like those in Vorkuta in the Arctic, where forced labor in coal mines claimed lives at an industrial pace. Perhaps forced labor in the reconstruction of destroyed cities like Kiev, bombed and occupied. Perhaps death along the way, succumbing to cold, hunger, or a merciful bullet. What was certain was one thing. For many, that icy road winding through bare forests and empty fields was the last place they would see, the grey horizon promising only more suffering. The war continued to advance, a juggernaut of tanks and infantry devouring the continent, and behind it, in the merciless snow, lay the silent tracks of those who could not keep up, mute ghosts haunting the survivors with visions of endless despair, where terror was a constant companion, hopelessness the air they breathed, and fear the fuel that propelled them, one agonizing step after another until the inevitable end. Hunger, disease, and total abandonment, after the exhausting march, which snaked along frozen roads like open veins in the desolate landscape of East Prussia or the snowy plains of Pomerania in mid-1945, there is no promised rest, nor the relief of a temporary refuge where bodies could recover. Instead, there is waiting, an agonizing pause that stretches into days, weeks, perhaps months, transforming time into a slow and inexorable instrument of torture. The survivors, those few who did not succumb to the biting cold or the occasional gunfire along the way, are thrown like disposable bales into makeshift corrals. Empty warehouses once full of grain, looted by the Nazis during the occupation, now echoing with the emptiness of defeat. Fields surrounded by rusty barbed wire, remnants of forced labor camps that the Germans themselves erected to enslave local populations. Or abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of cities like Königsberg, besieged and bombed into a labyrinth of rubble where the wind howls like tormented souls. There are no beds, only the hard floor covered by a thin layer of damp straw that reeks of mold and stagnant urine. There are not enough doctors, only a few overworked Soviet surgeons prioritizing their own wounded from fierce battles like Vistula Oder, where rivers became barriers of floating bodies. Many prisoners still bleed from poorly healed wounds, deep shrapnel cuts that pulsed with each beat of their weakened hearts. Others bear open wounds that were never properly cleaned, exposed to the contaminated air, swelling with yellowish pus that flowed like tears from a collective wound of humanity. Hunger arrives quickly, sharp as a rusty blade plunged into the stomach, constant as the throbbing of a chronic pain that offers no respite. Rations are minimal, when they exist at all, distributed sporadically by exhausted guards who barely had enough for themselves, in an army that depended on meager supplies stretched along overloaded supply lines since the 1944 counter-offensive. A piece of hard bread, stiffened by the cold to the point of cracking teeth, divided among several men in portions that barely fit in the palm of their hand. Water drawn from frozen puddles, breaking the ice with stones or boots to sip a murky liquid that carried the metallic taste of blood and earth. The stomach aches more each day, an emptiness that expands like a black hole, devouring the insides, and the body begins to consume itself, cannibalizing muscle and fat in a slow self-destruction that echoed the famine imposed on the Soviets during the siege of Leningrad, where more than 1 million perished with stomachs swollen from starvation. The weakest waste away until they become skeletal shadows, walking silhouettes that moved like ghosts in the fields, their cheeks sinking into deep hollows that transformed faces into living skulls, their eyes becoming too large for their faces, shining with a feverish gleam of despair that penetrated the soul of anyone who dared to look. With hunger come disease, an invisible army of plagues that spreads like wildfire, taking advantage of the body's weakness to invade and conquer. Lice spread through filthy clothes, torn fabric stiffened by dried sweat and coagulated blood, bringing typhus, that devouring fever that killed thousands on the Eastern Front, similar to the epidemics that ravaged Nazi concentration camps like Dachau, but now inverted in cruel retaliation of fate. Dysentery turns the ground into fetid mud, a sticky slime of feces and vomit that spread under bare feet, infecting wounds and making every movement a slippery agony. Deep coughs, hoarse as the barking of wild dogs, announce pneumonia, lungs filling with fluid as if drowning in an inland sea, echoing the deaths from exposure in the winter of 1941-1942, when soldiers froze in makeshift trenches. Wounds become infected, swell like grotesque balloons, rot with gangrene that exuded a sweet putrid stench, an odor that permeated the air like a toxic fog, mingling with the unforgettable smell of decomposition, a perfume of death that seeped into dreams and pores, turning existence into a sensory prison of horror. There are no medicines, only improvised herbs or nothing at all, in a system where medical supplies were reserved for active troops. Advancing towards Berlin, there is no isolation. The sick are piled up like firewood in human heaps where contagion spread like rumors in a terrified crowd. One man falls ill, coughing up dark blood that splatters the ground. Another catches it, his body trembling with chills that make his teeth chatter like castanets. Then another, a chain of suffering that transforms the camp into a hospital of horrors. At night, Low moans mingle with hallucinatory deliriums, hoarse voices calling for their mothers in broken whispers, evoking distant homes in rural Germany, or believing they are still on the front lines, shouting phantom orders for lost battles like Stalingrad, where the Soviet siege claimed 200,000 lives amidst the ice. The fever confuses everything, dissolving reality into a whirlwind of terrifying visions. Dead comrades rising like zombies, or the distant sound of tanks that never arrived. The night terror was palpable, a dark cloak that suffocated sleep, where the fear of not waking up intertwined with the hopelessness of surviving only to suffer more. The guards watched from a distance, vague silhouettes against the grey horizon, not out of constant malice, though the hatred for years of Nazi atrocities, burned villages in Belarus, massacres in Ukraine, might have hardened their hearts, but out of profound exhaustion and pragmatic necessity. The front demanded movement, a relentless advance that tolerated no delays, and sick prisoners were unproductive in the Siberian coal mines or in the reconstruction of devastated cities like Warsaw. Those who couldn't endure were left behind, lying in an isolated corner until they stopped breathing, their chests rising and falling in increasingly weak gasps, their eyes fixed on the cloudy sky as if searching for a divine salvation that would never come. The abandonment was total, a silent sentence that transformed humans into the debris of history. In the morning, stiff bodies, hardened by rigor mortis and the ice that preserved them, like macabre relics, are removed as if they were inanimate objects dragged by hooks or reluctant hands to mass graves dug in the hard earth. No names engraved, no meticulous records that could humanize the statistics. Just another number that will never be counted correctly, lost among the millions missing from the war, echoing the imprecise counts of Soviet victims in battles like Kursk. The living watch in silence, eyes lowered, avoiding the spectacle, knowing that tomorrow could be their turn. Terror settling in as a constant presence, hopelessness corroding the will to fight, the fear that each sunrise will bring only more agony. Here, far from the deafening gunfire and explosions that lit up nights like infernal bonfires, the war continues to kill, slowly as the melting of a glacier that crushes everything in its path, cold as the wind that penetrates bones and souls, and almost invisible, operating in the shadows of human negligence. For many wounded, abandoned during the chaotic retreat from the east, this is the true end. Not in heroic battle, with fleeting glory and posthumous medals, but consumed by hunger that devours from the inside out, by disease that transforms bodies into empty shells, and by complete oblivion, where names dissolve in the wind and stories are lost in the eternal snow, a silent epitaph for the cruelty of humanity in times of war. Civilians as the last hope. For a select few wounded, those rare survivors who defied the odds in a sea of certain death, fate took an unexpected turn, a tortuous path that snaked through the human chaos amidst the collapse of the Third Reich. During the endless march, on muddy roads that stretched like open wounds in the land of East Prussia or Silesia in 1945, in the chaos of a village hastily taken by the Soviets, burned wooden houses, streets riddled with bomb craters, air smelling of smoke and fear, or on a night when vigilance slackened, guards distracted by fatigue or the looting of abandoned supplies, they were left behind, not by summary execution with the dry crack of a rifle echoing like a definitive end, but by abandonment again, a cruel echo of the initial discarding by their own commanders. They fell by the roadside, bodies collapsing like puppets with cut strings, exhausted by the excruciating pain of wounds that bled incessantly. They are pushed out of the column by impatient guards who prioritize the pace of the advance, or simply left behind when they can no longer walk, their legs weakening like dry branches under the weight of accumulated fatigue from battles like that of Berlin, where the end approached like an inevitable shadow. This is where the civilians come in, figures emerging from the darkness like specters from a pre-war era, local inhabitants who survived the Nazi occupation and now faced Soviet retaliation. Peasants emerge from destroyed houses, structures of cracked bricks and collapsed roofs that once sheltered entire families, now reduced to ruins echoing the Allied bombings of 1944. Faces marked by hunger, furrowed by deep lines like valleys carved by years of rationing and plunder. Hands calloused by forced labor on collectivized farms or in Nazi munitions factories. Distrustful eyes, gleaming with a mixture of terror and resilience, eyes that had witnessed executions in public squares, like the Nazi retaliations against partisans in Belarus. They had already seen too much. Villages burned during the WWII German retreat, bodies of neighbors hanging from posts as macabre warnings, or the systematic rape that accompanied the advance of both armies. They know exactly who those men on the ground are. Enemies, occupiers, responsible for years of suffering, for scorched earth policies that left barren fields and shattered families. Yet, faced with a soldier too weak even to lift his head, his body trembling with feverish chills, hatred sometimes gives way to compassion, a glimpse of humanity that transcends uniforms and flags, echoing isolated acts of kindness amidst the horror, like the civilians who hid Jews during the Holocaust. Some civilians help in absolute silence, their muted gestures speaking volumes in a world of screams and explosions. They drag the wounded man into a dark barn, the air heavy with the smell of moldy hay and dried manure, cover him with rough straw that pricks his sensitive skin, give him a thin soup made from frozen potatoes dug from the hard earth, a broth that barely nourished but represented an act of rebellion against the war. They ask no questions, avoiding words that could betray accents or intentions. They don't ask for thanks, knowing that gratitude was a luxury in times of precarious survival. They know that if they are discovered by Soviet patrols or informing neighbors, they could be killed along with him, shot as collaborators in summary executions that punctuated the liberation of the East, a risk that amplified the terror of each hidden moment. Others choose differently, the weight of collective memory tipping the scales toward revenge. They denounce with a whisper to local authorities, point with trembling fingers to the hideout, call in Soviet soldiers to solve the problem, delivering the wounded as an offering to belated justice. For them, it is not gratuitous cruelty, but retribution for years of suffering, for villages like Oradour-sur-Glane, though French, echoing similar massacres in the East, for families executed in mass graves, as in Katyn, where thousands of Poles were massacred. Each village carries its own memory, its own open wound, a collective scar that bled with every sight of a German uniform. For the wounded soldier, every door slammed shut by the wind is a trial, a silent court where the verdict is unpredictable. Every glance exchanged with a civilian can mean life, a reluctant nod that opens a hiding place, or death, a gesture that calls the patrol. He learns not to speak, swallowing, words that could reveal his origin, not to beg, depending on unsolicited mercy, to simply exist in silence, hoping that someone will see in him a human being before a uniform, a son or brother, instead of an invader. The terror of this waiting was suffocating, his heart pounding like a dull drum. The hopelessness of depending on hostile strangers, the fear that compassion was a fleeting illusion. Some survive for weeks like this, hidden in damp attics or dark cellars, treated with herbs gathered from snowy forests, dirty rags boiled in murky water, and a willingness that defied the logic of war. Others die on the first night, their bodies finally giving way when the immediate danger passes, succumbing to accumulated exhaustion or infections that flourished in the dark. A quiet end amidst the chaos. These encounters rarely make it into history books, lost in the grand narratives of battles and treaties, but for those who lived through them, they are never forgotten, etched in memory like rare jewels in an ocean of suffering. Because in that hell of ice and abandonment, it was starving and terrified civilians, Polish, Ukrainian, or Baltic peasants who suffered under two yokes, who, for a fleeting moment, decided to defy the war, risking everything to save a life that the army itself had already discarded, an act of humanity that shone like a solitary star in the night sky of despair, reminding us that even in the abyss of terror, compassion could emerge as the last hope. Soldiers who begged for death. There comes a point when the body still breathes, but the mind has already given up. For many wounded abandoned in the Eastern Retreat, that point arrives quickly. The constant pain, the cold that never goes away, the hunger that gnaws from within. It all comes together until survival becomes punishment. Some men start asking for something unthinkable months in advance. They ask to die. It's not a hysterical scream. It's a calm, almost embarrassed plea. A soldier holds the arm of the last remaining medic and whispers that he can't take it anymore. Another looks at a guard, points to his own necrotic leg and shakes his head, as if to say, "It's over." Some wounded ask for a bullet. Others ask for more morphine than usual. They know exactly what they're asking for. They don't want heroism. They don't want medals. They don't want to be remembered. They just want that the pain stops. Among friends, these requests are the most difficult. A man begs his friend not to let him wake up again. He promises he won't scream. He promises no one will know. The friend cries silently, knowing that any decision will mark him forever. Some doctors, broken inside, do what they can to alleviate the suffering, higher doses of painkillers when they still exist. Others refuse, bound by an oath that no longer makes sense in that scenario. There is no right choice. There is only guilt, no matter the path. At night, when the wind beats against the walls and groans echo in the dark, many wish they would never see the sunrise. For them, death ceases to be the enemy, turn into rest, turn into liberation. These requests are rarely recorded. They don't appear in military reports. They don't enter the war statistics. But they existed thousands of times and reveal a brutal truth about the retreat from the East. There were men who no longer fought to live. They fought only to stop suffering. After the war ended, the world moved on, but the wounded soldiers abandoned in the Eastern Retreat were left in silence. Many never returned home. Others came back too broken to tell what they had experienced. In official records, they became mere numbers, missing or killed in action, with no one ever knowing how they truly died. Official history chose to remember battles and generals, not the men left behind, frozen, starving, and forgotten. There were no monuments, no tributes, only the slow erasure of their existence. The retreat from the East was not just a military decision, but a mass human tragedy. Every kilometer retreated cost unseen lives. For many, the war didn't end with gunfire, but with abandonment, cold, and the certainty that no one would return for them. Remembering these men is not to glorify war, but to reveal its true cost, because not everyone dies fighting. Some simply stay behind and disappear into the snow.